She walked into that gun store thinking she'd be dismissed, until the commander burst in, took one look, and broke protocol with a salute that changed everything. The bell above the gun store door chimed as she pushed it open, the faint metallic clang swallowed by the hum of conversation inside. The air carried a distinct blend of oil, leather, and faint gunpowder, a smell that clung to every corner of the shop. Rows of rifles lined the walls, handguns gleamed in glass cases, and the chatter of customers filled the space with an edge of competitiveness. She stepped inside quietly, her boots scuffing the floor. At 22, she was slim, composed, and determined, though her appearance didn't match the crowd around her. Most of the patrons were older men, broad-shouldered, loud, with military haircuts or hunting jackets. She wore a simple hoodie and jeans, her dark hair tied back. To them, she looked out of place. The first sneers started almost immediately. "Lost, sweetheart?" a man near the counter asked, his lips curling into a smirk. He rested a heavy hand on the glass case as if he owned the room. "The nail salon's 2 blocks down." Laughter bubbled from another customer nearby. "Or maybe she thinks this is a boutique. Careful, don't break a nail." The clerk behind the counter, a balding man with grease stains on his shirt, looked her up and down with disinterest. He didn't say a word, but his raised eyebrows told the same story. "You don't belong here." She ignored them. She had walked in with a reason, and she wasn't about to let a few barbs rattle her. Approaching the counter, she rested her hand lightly on the glass and asked, "Do you carry the XR-17? Her tone was calm, deliberate. The clerk scoffed. "That's not a toy. You even know what that is?" She met his gaze evenly. "Yes." That simple answer only made the mockery worse. A man browsing the rifles lay, armed closer, grinning at his friends. "Bet she saw it in a movie, thinks she can handle it." The room erupted in chuckles. It wasn't malicious in the way of fists or fights, but it was sharp enough to sting, a chorus of dismissals that echoed louder than gunfire. Her cheeks heated, but she held steady. She wasn't here to prove herself to strangers, she just wanted information. Still, the disdain pressed in from all sides, heavy and suffocating. "Maybe she needs something smaller," one man jeered, holding up a pink-handled revolver from the shelf. "Matches your manicure, sweetheart." The laughter swelled again. For a heartbeat, she considered walking out. The easy choice would be to leave, to let them have their petty victory. But something inside her resisted. She wasn't weak, she wasn't fragile, and she had every right to be here, just as much as they did. Her voice was even, but firm. "I asked about the XR-17. Do you have it, or not?" The counter clerk leaned back, folding his arms. "Even if we did, it's not for someone like you. That's a serious weapon." Another chorus of laughter followed. She stood there, surrounded by smirks and jeers, her heart pounding. On the outside, she looked calm. On the inside, she felt the walls closing in. And then, just as the laughter peaked, the bell above the door rang again. This time, the air changed. The sound of boots striking the floor echoed like thunder. The room quieted almost instantly. Heads turned toward the entrance. A man in uniform had stepped inside. His presence filled the space, commanding without a word. Medals glinted on his chest. His gaze was sharp, unwavering, the kind of gaze that could silence a battlefield. The commander had arrived, and everything was about to change. The commander's boots struck the tile floor with a steady rhythm, each step amplifying the silence that had fallen over the gun store. The laughter evaporated. The smirks faltered. Even the clerk behind the counter shifted uneasily, his earlier arrogance paling under the weight of the newcomer's presence. But for her, standing in the middle of it all, the tension twisted differently. The mocking words still rang in her ears. The laughter still pressed against her like an invisible wall. She'd told herself to stand tall, to keep her voice steady, but the truth was undeniable. Fear had clawed its way into her chest. Not fear of the weapons or the men around her, but fear of the judgment that seemed to follow her everywhere. She hated it. Hated the way their sneers made her question herself, the way every glance carried the same unspoken verdict, "You don't belong here." It was the same verdict she had faced in school, in jobs, in every room where she wasn't expected to succeed. And here it was again, dressed in camouflage and leather jackets. Her fists tightened at her sides. She refused to let them see the sting. The commander's presence should have been reassuring, but instead it magnified everything. If he was here, if he had seen even a moment of the mockery, then her humiliation felt 10 times heavier. She imagined what he must think. Another fragile girl out of her depth, another amateur chasing fantasies she couldn't handle. One of the men at the rifle rack leaned close to his friend and muttered, not quite low enough, "Bet she'll cry as soon as he speaks." Her throat burned. She wanted to whirl on him, to shout, to prove him wrong. But that, too, would be giving them what they wanted. Confirmation that she was emotional, unfit, a joke in a place that demanded steel. So she swallowed the words and lifted her chin higher. The commander stopped just a few feet from her. His gaze swept over the room, icy and unflinching, before landing squarely on her. For a moment she couldn't breathe. His eyes weren't mocking, but they were piercing, weighing her as if searching for the truth beneath the surface. The silence stretched. Every person in the room waited for his judgment. Her heartbeat thundered in her ears. Fear tried to coil tighter around her, whispering that he would side with them, that he would dismiss her like the rest. But beneath the fear, something else burned. Anger. Anger at being dismissed. Anger at being underestimated. Anger at herself for even caring what these people thought. Her voice, when it came, was quiet but steady. "I asked a question. I expect an answer." The words cut through the silence like a blade. The clerk blinked, taken aback, but didn't speak. The mocking men shifted uncomfortably. The commander's expression didn't change, but his head tilted slightly, as if acknowledging the steel hidden beneath her calm. She stood there, trembling on the inside, but refusing to back down. The fear was still there, gnawing at her ribs, but now it was harnessed, fused into defiance. If they wanted her to break, they would have to wait a long time. The commander's gaze lingered for another heartbeat before he finally moved. His boots echoed again as he took the last few steps, closing the distance until he stood directly in front of her. Then, without a word, his hand rose sharply to his brow in a crisp salute. Gasps rippled through the store. The same men who had mocked her now stared wide-eyed, their disbelief almost tangible. The clerk's jaw slackened, and she, caught between fear and vindication, felt the ground shift beneath her. The commander had just turned the mockery into silence. The salute hung in the air like a thunderclap, shocking the gun store into silence. For a heartbeat, no one moved, no one dared to. The mocking laughter that had filled the room only minutes earlier had been replaced by a stunned, breathless quiet. Her heart skipped as she blinked at the commander, unsure if what she saw was real. A salute? For her? The commander's posture was impeccable, shoulders squared, back straight, hand pressed firmly to his brow. It wasn't casual, wasn't polite. It was crisp, deliberate, a salute given only out of genuine respect. The clerk's face drained of colour. He fumbled with the edge of the counter as if trying to steady himself. One of the men who had laughed the loudest earlier now stood frozen. His smirk collapsed into a slack-jawed gape. Another muttered under his breath, "What the hell?" Every eye turned from the commander to her, then back again, trying to piece together what was happening. The commander dropped his hand and took a step closer. His voice, when he spoke, was deep and commanding, carrying the weight of authority earned through years of service. "You have my respect," he said, loud enough for everyone in the store to hear. The words landed like a hammer. The atmosphere shifted instantly. The same men who had mocked her for being weak, for being out of place, now stared at her as if she were someone entirely different. Her lips parted, but no sound came out. She felt the sting of tears pressing at the corners of her eyes, not from humiliation this time, but from the sheer weight of vindication. She had stood her ground, she had endured their jeers, and now, before them all, the commander himself had silenced them with a gesture stronger than any retort she could have given. The man by the rifle rack, the one who had joked she'd cry, shifted uncomfortably. His gaze darted away, his earlier arrogance shriveling her. Under the spotlight of the commander's respect, the laughter that once filled the store felt like a distant echo, embarrassing even to those who had participated in it. She straightened her back, suddenly aware that the room no longer weighed her down. Instead, it felt lighter, as if the scales had tipped in her favor. For the first time since she'd entered, she no longer felt like an intruder. She belonged here, perhaps more than anyone else in the room. The commander glanced briefly at the clerk. "Answer her question." The clerk swallowed hard. Yes, sir, we..." We do have the XR-17 in stock. His voice trembled. He avoided looking at her, ashamed. She nodded once, her expression calm, controlled, though inside, adrenaline still pulsed through her veins. Thank you. The commander's presence loomed beside her, not as a shield, but as confirmation. His salute had already rewritten the narrative. She was no longer the girl mocked in the corner of a gun store. She was someone worth respecting. He leaned slightly toward her, lowering his voice so only she could hear. You don't need their approval. Remember that. Her throat tightened, but she managed a small nod. With that, he stepped back, scanning the room one final time. His gaze lingered on the men who had laughed at her, pinning each of them with a glare sharp enough to cut. None dared meet his eyes. Then, without another word, he turned and strode toward the door, his boots striking the floor with the same unshakable rhythm as when he'd entered. The bell chimed as he left, but the silence inside remained. All that was left were the stunned faces of those who had mocked her, and the quiet strength burning inside her chest. She wasn't invisible anymore. The unexpected entrance of the commander had changed everything. The echo of the commander's salute lingered long after he left, like a thunderclap rolling through the gun store. For a moment, no one dared move, as if the walls themselves were holding their breath. She stood, rooted to the spot, her pulse racing. The sting of humiliation that had threatened to crush her minutes earlier had been erased, replaced by something powerful, something she hadn't expected. Validation. The commander's salute had done what her words alone could never accomplish. It silenced the room. The clerk cleared his throat nervously and shuffled behind the counter. His earlier arrogance had dissolved, leaving only unease. I'll get the XR-17 for you. His hands fumbled as he pulled keys from his pocket, unlocking the case with a clink that sounded much too loud in the quiet. The same men who had laughed at her now avoided her eyes. One stared hard at the floor. Another shifted his weight, shame creeping into his posture. The man who had mocked her manicure pretended to study the rifles on the wall, his face flushed red. None of them dared speak. She felt their silence pressing against her back as she watched the clerk place the weapon on the counter. The XR-17 gleamed under the fluorescent lights, sleek and formidable. It was exactly what she'd asked for, nothing more, nothing less. Here, the clerk muttered. Her fingers brushed the metal as she lifted it carefully, her hands steady despite the adrenaline coursing through her. The weapon had weight, but it didn't intimidate her. She had handled heavier burdens before. When she glanced up, the clerk's eyes darted away. For once there was no smirk, no dismissal, only respect grudgingly earned. The other men still stood frozen, trapped between disbelief and embarrassment. Their silence was almost comical. A few minutes ago, they had filled the room with laughter at her expense. Now, not one of them dared to utter a word. She turned toward them slowly, not to gloat, but to let them see her face. No tears, no trembling, only calm. Her voice was even, quiet, but it carried in the silence. You laughed. The words cut like a blade, simple, undeniable. No one answered. She tilted her head, her expression steady. And yet, he saluted. That truth landed heavier than any insult she could have thrown back at them. They had mocked her, dismissed her, tried to make her small. But the commander, the one man in the room whose opinion mattered, had recognized her worth. She set the XR-17 back on the counter gently, her point made without further words. Then she turned and walked toward the door. The silence followed her, thick and suffocating, pressing on the men who remained. As she reached the door, the bell chimed softly, but before stepping out, she paused. Without looking back, she said, "Respect doesn't come from laughter. It comes from action. Remember that." Then she pushed open the door and left. Outside, the cool air hit her skin, refreshing after the stifling tension inside. She drew in a deep breath, her shoulders finally relaxing. The commander was gone, but his gesture lingered in her chest like a flame. He had saluted her, and in that single motion he had shifted the balance. She no longer carried the weight of their scorn. Instead, she carried the quiet strength of knowing that even in the face of mockery, her dignity had remained intact. The respectful salute had turned her humiliation into triumph, and the men inside would never forget it. When she stepped out of the gun store, the fresh air felt different, almost cleansing. The sting of humiliation she had carried inside now seemed like a distant memory, erased by the single gesture of a salute. But the true weight of what had happened settled on her as she walked down the sidewalk, her footsteps echoing in rhythm with her thoughts. The commander hadn't saluted her as a joke or out of pity, he had meant it. The clarity of his eyes, the firmness of his posture, had told her that much. It was a salute born of recognition, of respect, earned not through power or position, but through something quieter, harder to define: humility. Inside the store, she hadn't shouted back at the men who mocked her. She hadn't thrown insults or raised her voice to demand respect. Instead, she had stood firm, asked her question, and held her ground with calm determination. That quiet strength had spoken louder than any argument, and the commander had seen it. For years she had been told she didn't belong in certain jobs, in certain hobbies, in certain places. Always pushed aside, always underestimated, she had learned to carry herself with modesty, never demanding more than the bare minimum of acknowledgement. Yet in that moment, her humility had collided with his authority, and it had created something powerful. Humility met power, and power had bowed to it. She stopped for a moment at the corner of the street, her hand brushing away the last trace of tears at the edge of her eyes. The city bustled around her, cars passing, voices carrying, life going on as if nothing extraordinary had happened. But she knew better. Something inside her had shifted. The men in that store would remember the commander's salute for the rest of their lives. Every time they saw a young woman walk through the door, they'd think twice before laughing. They'd remember the silence that followed, and the way their arrogance had crumbled under a simple, respectful gesture. And she? She would remember too, but not for their sake. She would remember because it had shown her something she hadn't fully believed until that moment. She was worthy of respect, no matter who tried to take it from her. As she stood there, lost in thought, she heard footsteps behind her. The sound was steady, deliberate. She turned slightly, and her breath caught. It was him. The commander had followed her out of the store, his stride purposeful, his presence still commanding. People on the street glanced at him as he passed, some nodding in acknowledgement, others stepping aside instinctively. He stopped a few feet from her, his eyes steady, his expression unreadable but not unkind. "You handled yourself well in there," he said. His voice was calmer now, stripped of the sharpness it had carried inside the store. She swallowed, unsure of how to respond. "I just asked a question." His lips curved faintly, not quite a smile, but close. Sometimes the smallest actions speak the loudest. You didn't need to shout. You didn't need to prove yourself with bravado. You stood firm. That's what matters. Her chest tightened at his words. It felt strange, almost surreal, to be recognized this way. Why did you salute?" she asked, her voice low. The commander's gaze didn't waver. "Because respect isn't about rank, or gender, or appearances. It's about what a person shows in the moment. And in that room, you showed more strength than any of them." His words struck deep, sinking into the places where doubt had always lived. She lowered her eyes, humbled. "I don't know what to say." "You don't need to say anything," he replied. "Just remember it. Carry it with you." And with that, he gave a small nod, turned and walked away, his boots fading into the city noise. She stood there for a long moment, the weight of his words pressing into her chest. Humility had met power, and it had been enough to change everything. The city carried on as if nothing had happened, cars weaving through traffic, shopkeepers calling out to customers, and strangers hurrying past each other without notice. But for her, the world felt still, suspended in the echo of a single salute and the words that had followed it. She walked slowly, her thoughts heavy but no longer weighed down by humiliation. Instead, they carried a strange new warmth, an ember of strength she hadn't realized was hers to claim. Inside the gun store, she had been the target of laughter, sneers, and judgment. They had mocked her because she didn't look like she belonged, because they believed strength was something loud, brash, and showy. But she had left them with silence. Silence carved by respect. Silence that weighed heavier than their laughter ever had. That was her victory. Not the weapon on the counter, not the clerk's stammering apology, not even the commander's salute, as powerful as it had been. Her victory lay in the fact that she hadn't broken. She hadn't shouted or begged for approval. She had stood her ground, and in the end, the room had bent to her, not the other way around. The silent win. She stopped by a small bench on the corner and sat down, the cool iron pressing against her legs. For a long time, she just breathed. In, out. Her hands trembled faintly in her lap, a delayed echo of the adrenaline that had fueled her strength. She thought about the faces of the men inside, smirks wiped away, laughter cut short, eyes darting anywhere but at her. They would remember, and maybe, just maybe, the next time they saw someone who didn't fit, they'd think twice before mocking. The thought didn't fill her with pride, it filled her with peace. It wasn't about proving them wrong, it wasn't about revenge or validation, it was about knowing she had faced ridicule and refused to crumble. That was enough. The door of the G.A. store opened again behind her, and she glanced back. One of the men who had laughed the loudest stepped out. He spotted her on the bench, hesitated, then quickly crossed the street to avoid her gaze. She didn't smile. She didn't gloat. She simply turned her eyes back to the street, letting the moment pass. The silent win didn't need applause. Her phone buzzed in her pocket, pulling her from her thoughts. A message from a friend lit up the screen. "Did you get what you needed?" Her fingers hovered over the keyboard for a moment. Then she typed back, "Yes, more than I expected." She set the phone down and leaned back, lifting her face to the sky. Clouds drifted lazily overhead, their slow march across the blue, reminding her that life moved on. This moment, too, would pass, but its lesson would remain. Strength didn't always roar. Sometimes it was quiet. Sometimes it was the choice to keep standing when the world tried to push you down. Sometimes it was silence so undeniable that it demanded to be respected. She rose from the bench and started walking again, her steps lighter now, her posture straighter. The city welcomed her back into its rhythm, but something in her had changed. She didn't need the approval of strangers. She didn't need laughter to stop or apologies to be made. She carried her worth within her, and no amount of mockery could strip it away. Back inside the gun store, they would talk about her. They would whisper about the girl who had walked in alone and left with the commander's salute. They would try to explain it, maybe even downplay it, but none of that mattered, because she knew the truth. She had walked into that room unseen. She had walked out seen, and that, more than anything, was her silent win.